I never wanted to be the woman who interrupts a wedding. I never pictured myself standing at the back of a church, heart thrumming so hard I thought it might rupture, clutching a manila folder filled with evidence that would turn every polished smile into a gaping mouth. Yet here I was. My name is Marian Holloway, 68 years old, widow or so most people believed, but the man standing at the altar wearing the same navy suit he'd worn when he swore to love me until death was not a widower, and I was not any man's ghost. My hands were trembling as I stepped over the threshold, but I forced myself to lift my chin. The scent of roses and old wood mingled in the air. Everyone turned when the door creaked. The music stopped mid-bar. Even from here, I could see the tight line of his jaw as he registered who had just walked into his perfect day. I wanted to feel triumphant. I wanted to feel righteous. But all I felt was an aching sadness in my chest that something so ordinary, a wedding, had become the battlefield for my dignity. I took a slow breath, and then I remembered every time he'd called me unstable. Every time he'd told people I was losing my mind, that I'd been imagining things. The pitying looks, the whispered gossip, the invitations that stopped coming. He'd been laying the groundwork for this day for years, and I'd nearly let him bury me alive under his version of the truth. No, not today. I tightened my grip on the folder. The edges bit into my palm. I welcomed the pain. It reminded me that I was real, and that what I was about to do mattered more than my pride. The officiant looked from me to the groom, clearly uncertain. Can I help you, ma'am?" I swallowed, and my voice came out softer than I intended. "Yes, you can pause." Someone in the front row, his sister Janice, gave a brittle little laugh. "Oh, Marian, for heaven's sake, this is pathetic." Pathetic. That word settled in my ribs like a splinter. For months after he left, I'd wake up in the middle of the night gasping, thinking that if only I'd tried harder, if only I'd been better, he might have stayed. But no, he hadn't left because I was unlovable. He'd left because he was a coward who thought he could erase me. Pathetic, I repeated softly, meeting her gaze. "You always did think I was less than you, but at least I never built my life on lies." Her face pinched. From the altar, he finally spoke. "Marian, you don't need to do this." I felt my lip tremble. God help me, some part of me still wanted him to be the man I'd married, the one who'd kissed my forehead every morning for 30 years. But that man had died long before he'd tried to bury me with him. "Yes," I said, "I do." And with that, I lifted the folder so everyone could see. The gold-embossed seal of the state of California glinted under the chandeliers. My marriage certificate, the real one. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The officiant cleared his throat nervously. I think we need to pause this ceremony," I finished for him. I glanced at the bride, a willowy woman in her 30s with wide, panicked eyes. She looked like she might faint. I almost pitied her. Almost. But she had known. I'd sent her letters. She'd ignored them. She'd decided I was just the bitter old wife who couldn't let go. Well, I was many things, but I wasn't a liar. A security guard shifted uncomfortably near the side aisle. I held up my free hand. "I'm not here to cause harm. I'm here because this man, I gestured toward him, never filed for divorce. He told you all I was unstable, that I'd disappeared, but I was very much alive." The bride clapped a hand to her mouth. I took a step forward, feeling every eye on me, every drop of sweat slide down my spine. "I have text messages, financial records, and legal counsel confirming that this marriage is bigamous. If you don't believe me, you can read them yourselves." I paused, to look around the room. It was like peering into a gallery of stunned statues. For so long, I'd imagined this moment, sometimes with dread, sometimes with fierce longing. But standing here, all I felt was clarity. I was no longer afraid of being called unstable, because the truth was solid in my hands, and it was my turn to speak. He made a move toward me, his face pale. "Marian, please, let's not do this here." "This is exactly where it belongs," I said, "because this is where you tried to erase me." I turned to the guests, my voice growing steadier. "I apologize for the disruption. I truly do. But you all deserve to know who you're dealing with. And so does she." The bride whimpered something I couldn't hear. The officiant nodded mutely. And for the first time in years, I felt the quivering weight in my chest begin to lift. I looked down at the marriage certificate and then back up at him. "You thought I would hide," I said, my voice a low, calm blade. "But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." And before anyone could try to hustle me out, I turned to the side aisle and began to tell them everything. How he'd started his campaign to make me look unbalanced. How he'd stolen years of my life. How he'd woven his lies into the fabric of every relationship I had. And as I spoke, I knew this was just the beginning. They used to call us the golden couple. We'd been married nearly 40 years. In all that time, I thought I knew the man I'd chosen to spend my life with. His name was Walter Holloway. He was dependable, charming, in the steady way a man gets when he grows older. He liked routine. Cornflakes for breakfast, reading the paper by the window, mowing the lawn every Saturday morning. When people asked how we'd lasted so long, I'd smile and say it was because he made me feel safe. Because when the world felt too big or too fast, Walter was the place I could rest. Looking back now, I realize that was the first lie I told myself. It started so small, the unraveling. A missed dinner here, a sudden business trip there. At first, I didn't think much of it. We were older. We'd earned a little independence. I had my garden club, my book circle, my volunteer shifts at the library. But it was when he stopped coming home with the same quiet contentment that I felt a tiny chill slip under the door. I'd ask, "How was your day?" He'd shrug and say, "Fine." He never asked about mine anymore. One evening, I set the table with the good china. It wasn't our anniversary or any special occasion. I just missed us. I made pot roast the way he liked, and I even put on a little lipstick. He came in late, smelling of aftershave and something floral that wasn't me. He took one look at the candles and the plates and the hopeful smile I couldn't hide, and he sighed. "Marian, what is this?" he asked, rubbing his forehead. "I thought maybe we could sit together," I said, "like we used to." His eyes flicked to the clock. "I'm tired." He sat anyway, though. I remember how he chewed without tasting, how he barely looked up. That night, after the dishes were washed, I lay awake beside him while he slept, wondering why it felt like I was mourning someone who was still breathing. That was 3 years ago. If I had known then that he was already laying the groundwork to vanish, I don't know what I would have done. Maybe I would have tried harder. Maybe I would have left first. Maybe I would have accepted that love. No matter how long you nurture it, can still rot from the inside out. But I was raised to endure, to hold the line. So I stayed. And I didn't see the second act coming. It was subtle at first, little comments he'd drop in front of friends. "Marian forgets things these days." Or, "She's been having a hard time keeping up." I'd laugh it off, say, "I'm just tired." But I noticed how people stopped asking me to help organize events, how they'd exchange glances when I stumbled over a date or a name. Once, when our niece invited us to her baby shower, Walter told her I wasn't feeling well. I hadn't even known she'd asked. When I confronted him, he smiled in that pitying way that makes your bones feel hollow. "I'm just trying to help you, Marian. You don't need to be embarrassed." Embarrassed. I started to doubt myself. Had I really forgotten that phone call? Had I really misplaced those bills? I began writing things down, little notes to myself on the kitchen chalkboard. Dates, times, reminders, just in case. The first time I found one of my notes crumpled in the trash, I told myself it was an accident. The second time, I knew better. I wish I could say I left then, that I gathered my dignity and walked away. But it's not easy to walk out of a life you've built brick by brick. Not when you're nearly 70. Not when everyone you know believes the narrative he's spinning. I tried to talk to my sister, Dolores. She'd always been my closest ally. "Dolores," I whispered over the phone one evening, my voice cracking, "I don't know what's happening. He keeps telling people I'm unwell, that I'm slipping." She sighed. "Marian, You have to consider maybe you are. It happens to everyone eventually. I pressed a fist to my mouth so she wouldn't hear the sound that burst out of me. Even she believed him. That was the moment I stopped confiding in anyone. I became a ghost in my own home, moving quietly so I wouldn't provoke his sighs, his heavy silences, and all the while, he was preparing his exit. He began staying out later, disappearing for whole weekends. When I asked where he'd been, he'd say, "Visiting old friends. You wouldn't know them." I would stare at his back as he walked away, and I'd think, when did you stop loving me? But that wasn't the right question, was it? The real question was, when did you start hating me enough to erase me? I didn't have the answer then. All I had was the sinking dread that one day he'd be gone, and everyone would believe it was because I was too broken to hold on to. That day came 6 months later. He left a note on the kitchen counter, 3 sentences. "Marian, I can't do this anymore. I hope you find peace. Please don't contact me. No explanation, no apology, just a clean severing of the life we'd shared." I sat on the floor, the note clutched in my hand, and I wept. Not because he was gone, but because I knew, in that instant, that he had spent years making sure no one would question why. I wish I could tell you that I found my strength right away, but it took months of grief and humiliation before I decided that if he wanted to call me unstable, I'd show him just how clear my mind really was. I'd show them all. After he left, it was as if someone flipped a switch in our small town. People I'd known for decades wouldn't look me in the eye at the grocery store. If they did, it was with that pitying, patronizing expression that makes you want to shrink right out of your own skin. One afternoon, I ran into Janice, his sister, outside the pharmacy. She clutched her handbag to her chest like I might lunge for it. "Marian," she said, voice syrupy with false concern, "are you managing all right? Walter said you've been confused lately." I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. What was I supposed to say? That my husband of 40 years had turned into a stranger? That he'd been rewriting history while I was still living in it? "I'm fine," I lied. She gave me a look that said she didn't believe a word. "If you ever need help, dear, just ask." As she walked away, I felt something brittle crack inside me. It wasn't enough for him to leave. He wanted everyone to think it was my fault, that he'd been driven out by my instability. When I got home, I sank into the armchair by the window, the one where I'd watched him mow the lawn year after year. I pressed my palms to my eyes and tried to make sense of it. Had it really all been pretend? Had every smile, every birthday card, every shared Sunday morning been part of some long con? I didn't have answers, but I had something he hadn't counted on. I had my memory, and I had a rising fury that would not be tamped down. That night, I poured myself a glass of Merlot and pulled out the small fireproof box we kept in the hall closet, the one that held our important documents, our marriage certificate, insurance policies, tax records. The certificate was there, crisp and official, with the gold state seal. The date, June 12, 1975. We had never divorced. No matter how many stories he told, no matter how many people he convinced, he was still legally my husband. I sat back and let that fact settle into my bones. For months, he'd been parading around with her, the woman he called his fiancée, telling everyone he'd moved on, that I was too unstable to be part of his life, that it was sad, really, how I'd lost touch with reality, but I hadn't. He was the liar, and someday he would choke on the web he'd spun. It was around this time that the phone calls started. Late at night, when the house was dark and my thoughts were loudest, the phone would ring once, twice. No voice on the other end, just silence. At first, I told myself it was a wrong number, but when it happened again and again, always in the quiet hours, I knew it was him. He wanted me rattled. He wanted me to crack, to prove the narrative he'd sold to everyone who would listen. I refused. I began documenting everything. I bought a small notebook, blue, hardbound, and started recording the dates and times of the calls. I wrote down every conversation I had with his family, every time someone hinted that I was unwell. If they were going to call me unstable, I would give them evidence of my clarity. One evening, around 2 in the morning, the phone rang again. I didn't answer. Instead, I picked up the receiver after the second ring and pressed the record button on the small cassette recorder I'd borrowed from the library. Nothing but breathing. "Walter," I said, my voice calm and steady, "I know it's you. I don't know what you're trying to accomplish, but it won't work." Click. The line went dead. I stared at the receiver in my hand, feeling an unexpected flicker of triumph. He was watching me. He was afraid of what I might do. And he should have been. I started gathering more than just phone logs. I combed through our joint bank statements. The months before he left, he'd been withdrawing cash in steady increments. Hundreds here, thousands there. When I called the bank to ask where the money had gone, the clerk sounded uncomfortable. "I'm afraid I can't disclose that, Mrs. Holloway," she said. "Your husband has requested confidentiality." Confidentiality and from his own wife. I thanked her politely, hung up, and then stared at the ledger in my hands. It was all right there, in black and white. He was planning this long before he left that note on the counter. I didn't sleep much after that. Instead, I spent my nights combing through every scrap of paper in our files. I found receipts for hotel stays in Sacramento and Monterey. He'd been taking her on trips while I was home, wondering why he didn't want to be around me. I took the receipts and laid them in a neat pile next to the marriage certificate. Evidence. Proof. I wasn't losing my mind. The final piece fell into place one Thursday afternoon when I received a letter addressed to the former Mrs. Holloway. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, expensive. I slid it open with a kitchen knife and pulled out an invitation. "Walter and Miss Chelsea Ann Miller cordially invite you to celebrate their wedding on Saturday, the 14th of May. I read it 3 times, my heart thumping so loudly I felt it in my throat. Former Mrs. Holloway. They'd decided I didn't exist anymore. He had counted on my shame, on my silence. And for a moment, just one, I almost gave it to him. I thought about tearing the invitation up, about crawling into bed and pulling the covers over my head. But then I thought about every time he'd told someone I was too frail, too confused, too broken to matter, and I knew I would not be erased. I placed the invitation beside my growing stack of evidence, and in that moment, I decided exactly where I'd be on the 14th of May, standing at the back of that ceremony, holding the truth in my hands. In the days after that invitation arrived, I moved through my house like a woman preparing for battle. I sorted through old photographs, legal documents, anything that could help me tell the story he was determined to bury. Sometimes I'd find myself staring at a picture of us, me in a blue dress with a daisy pinned to my hair, him with his hand on my shoulder. We looked so ordinary, so content. If you'd shown me that photo when it was taken, I'd have sworn up and down that I knew this man's heart. Now all I could think was how carefully he'd been setting the stage for my disappearance. Because that's what this was, wasn't it? He didn't just want to leave. He wanted to vanish in a way that made me look like a shadow of the woman I'd once been. An unreliable narrator no one would trust if I tried to speak up. I remember the first time it really hit me that he was never coming back. It was late March. A neighbor knocked to let me know she'd seen Walter at a farmer's market in the next town over, holding hands with a tall blonde woman. "He looked happy," she said, avoiding my eyes. "I thought you should know." I thanked her, closed the door, and pressed my forehead to the wood. It wasn't just that he was gone. It was the way he'd rewritten the script so thoroughly that everyone else simply accepted it. People stopped calling to check in. Friends who'd once shared cups of coffee and slices of peach pie with me at the kitchen table now avoided my gaze in public. It was easier, I suppose, to pretend I was the problem. To pretend Walter was a decent man who'd just been driven away by the weight of caring for a woman who'd lost her mind. But I hadn't lost anything. I was more clear-eyed than I'd been in years, and I intended to prove it. I spent the weeks before the wedding doing what Walter never expected. Preparing. I hired an attorney, a woman named Julia Cook who specialized in family law. She was young, maybe 40, but she had a no-nonsense energy that steadied me. I still remember the look on her face when I spread my collection of documents across her desk. "You've been thorough," she said, sounding almost impressed. "I've had time," I replied. My voice didn't shake. She paged through the receipts, the texts, the marriage certificate. "Has he filed for divorce at any point?" she asked. "No," I said, "and I've checked with the county clerk's office twice." Julia's eyebrows lifted. "Then he can't legally remarry?" She said it so plainly, so matter-of-fact, that a strange lightness bloomed in my chest. It was the first time in months I felt like someone believed me without needing to be persuaded. I pressed my hand to my heart to keep it from flying out of my ribs. Can you come with me to the wedding?" I asked. She paused, her pen resting against the file. "That's highly irregular," she admitted. "Irregular doesn't mean impossible," I said. A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "No," she agreed, "it doesn't." And so we made a plan. While I arranged the legal side, I also prepared myself for the spectacle I knew it would become. I knew people would say I was vengeful, bitter, unstable. Let them. What was the point of shrinking back now after all he'd taken? He had already told every lie he could think of. There was nothing left to protect. The night before the wedding, I sat at the kitchen table and laid everything out in a neat, methodical line. The marriage certificate, bank statements showing joint accounts he'd been draining, hotel receipts, screenshots of text messages. I ran my fingertips over each piece. This was the story he'd tried to erase. I was going to tell it whether he liked it or not. I thought I would feel nervous when the morning came. But when I woke up on May 14th, there was nothing but a still, steady determination in my chest. I showered, dressed in my best slate gray suit, and pinned my hair up in the tidy twist Walter used to compliment when he still pretended to love me. I ate a small breakfast, toast and coffee, and looked around the kitchen as if I were seeing it for the first time. Every cabinet, every scuffed floorboard held the ghost of our life together, but it didn't hold me anymore. I tucked the manila folder under my arm and locked the door behind me. Julia met me at the courthouse steps. "You ready?" she asked. I took a slow breath. "Yes," I said. We drove in silence to the church. I could feel my pulse thudding in my neck as we pulled up to the curb. The parking lot was full. Cars parked in neat rows, each one belonging to someone who thought they were gathering to celebrate a new chapter. None of them knew they were about to witness the final act of a story Walter had tried to keep hidden. Julia rested her hand lightly on my arm. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. But I did. Because if I didn't, it would be like admitting he'd been right about me all along, that I was too weak to stand up for myself, that I was too broken to matter. I looked at her, then past her to the arched double doors that were propped open to let in the warm spring air. Inside, the music was starting. I squared my shoulders. "Let's go," I said. And I walked up the steps, my heart steady, my mind clear, ready to reclaim the life he'd tried to take from me. Walking into that church felt like stepping into a memory I hadn't agreed to keep. It was all so familiar, in that glossy, brittle way of staged happiness. The white ribbons on the pews, the polished floor reflecting stained glass, the hush that always falls over a crowd before the bride arrives. I stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching. Walter was at the front, adjusting his cuffs with that same practiced composure he'd worn all our years together. Beside him, the officiant murmured something I couldn't hear. He looked content. For a moment, just one, I wondered if I was about to destroy something that had made him happy. Then I thought about the late-night phone calls, the months of isolation, the note on the kitchen counter, and the pitying looks I'd endured from people who once called themselves my friends. No, he had destroyed plenty on his own. I was just pulling back the curtain. Julia stepped up beside me, her heels clicking on the marble. "Ready?" she asked softly. I nodded. My mouth was dry. We began walking down the side aisle, slow and deliberate, as if we were part of the procession. The first person to notice was Janice. She turned, her eyes going wide. "Marian," she hissed, her voice low and furious. "What are you doing here?" I met her gaze evenly. "I'm exercising my rights." "You're going to embarrass yourself," she said, her cheeks flushing pink. "No," I corrected gently. "I'm going to embarrass your brother." I moved past her before she could respond. When we reached the front, the officiant looked startled. "Ma'am?" But I lifted my hand to silence him. "Walter," I said, my voice steady. "We need to speak." His head snapped up. The moment he saw the folder in my hands, the color drained from his face. For years, I had imagined what it would feel like to confront him. I thought I'd feel vindicated, righteous. But standing there with every guest watching, all I felt was tired. Tired of carrying the weight of his lies. Tired of the smallness he'd wrapped around my life. Tired of pretending I was the one who had broken everything. "What is this?" he demanded, though his voice wobbled. I held up the marriage certificate. "This," I said clearly, so everyone could hear, "is proof that you are still married to me." A collective gasp shuddered through the congregation. Behind me, Janice muttered something sharp and profane. Walter took a step closer. I saw his jaw clench, the muscle ticking in that familiar way it always did when he was cornered. "Marian," he said, pitching his voice low as if it might somehow make me cower. "You don't understand what you're doing." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I said. I lifted the folder higher. "This is our marriage certificate, Walter. Dated, signed, and filed with the county. You never divorced me." The bride, Chelsea, let out a strangled little noise. I turned to her. "I sent you letters," I said, more gently than I felt. "I tried to warn you. You ignored me." Her mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Walter raked a hand through his hair, trying to recover his composure. "You're unwell," he said loudly, his eyes darting to the crowd. "Everyone knows you haven't been yourself." There it was, the story he'd been cultivating, the lie he thought would protect him from the truth. I felt something cool and bright unfurl in my chest, an unshakable calm that told me this was the moment I'd been moving toward all along. "No," I said quietly, my voice carrying over the hushed audience. "I am perfectly well, and I have documentation to prove it." Julia stepped forward, her posture crisp and professional. "I'm Mrs. Holloway's attorney," she announced. "This marriage is legally binding and has never been dissolved. Any attempt to enter a new marriage would be considered bigamy under state law." Walter's face went the color of old parchment. The officiant stammered, I can't proceed with the ceremony under these circumstances." "No," Julia said coolly. "You can't." For a moment, the room was so silent, I could hear the faint whir of the ceiling fans overhead. Chelsea began to shake. "You told me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You told me it was over, that she was senile." I almost pitied her, but she had chosen to believe the worst of me because it was easier than questioning the man she loved. I watched her sway on her feet, her veil fluttering as she pressed a trembling hand to her forehead. She looked like a woman realizing her life was built on sand. Walter opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw it. Finally. A flicker of something like fear, not because he was worried about my feelings, but because he realized in that instant that I wasn't the fragile woman he'd tried to paint me as. I was the only person in that room with the power to end this farce. I turned to the guests, scanning the rows of faces, some shocked, some smug, some stricken. "I apologize for the interruption," I said evenly, but I could not allow this deception to continue. I met Chelsea's eyes one last time. "You deserve to know who you're marrying," I told her, and then I turned back to Walter. "You thought I would hide," I said softly. "But you were wrong." Julia put a hand on my shoulder. "Would you like to leave?" she asked quietly. I looked around the church, feeling the last threads of shame loosen from my chest. "No," I said. "Not yet." Because there was still more to reveal, and I wanted every single person in that room to hear it. For a few long seconds after I spoke, the entire church felt frozen in place. No one knew where to look. Chelsea's veil was still trembling against her shoulders. The officiant was staring down at his notes as if maybe, if he didn't make eye contact, he could pretend he hadn't just witnessed the disintegration of a man's carefully fabricated life. And Walter? Walter was breathing through his nose, hands clenched at his sides. I recognized that look. It was the same expression he'd worn the day he left, equal parts contempt and panic. He'd always been terrified of exposure. He was a man who could lie with the calm ease of someone ordering a cup of coffee, but he couldn't bear to be caught in the act. It was almost pitiful. Almost. When he finally found his voice, he turned to the crowd and lifted his hands as if he could smooth everything over by sheer force of will. "There's been a misunderstanding," he began, glancing quickly at me. "Marian has had some trouble." "I haven't," I cut in, my voice stronger than I expected. "But you have." The officiant looked from Walter to me, his brow furrowed. "I think perhaps we should all step outside to discuss this." "No," I said calmly. "I'd like everyone to hear." A ripple of unease passed through the front rows. Janice stood up, her voice shrill. "Marian, you've made your point." "Have I?" I asked her, turning to face her fully. "Because I don't think you understand exactly how much he's lied to you." Janice's mouth snapped shut. I stepped closer to Walter, close enough to see the fine lines etched around his eyes. "You didn't just leave," I said softly. "You didn't just fall out of love. You planned this." He swallowed, throat bobbing. "You started draining our accounts months before you left," I continued. "You told everyone I was confused, that I couldn't manage on my own." I held up the blue notebook. "And here are the records of every withdrawal, every time you called our joint bank and pretended you needed to protect me from myself." More murmurs. I didn't look at the guests. I kept my gaze fixed on the man I had once believed would be the last person to betray me. "You wanted me isolated," I said. "You wanted me so humiliated that I wouldn't fight back." Walter's jaw tightened. "I was trying to protect you," he said. A bark of laughter escaped me. "Protect me? By stealing from me? By lying to everyone I loved?" He didn't answer. Chelsea took a small, wavering step back, clutching her bouquet like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "Walter," she whispered, voice ragged, "you told me you were divorced." He looked at her then, and in that flicker of desperation, I saw exactly how much he cared. Not about me, not even about her, but about the neat little life he thought he could construct from our ashes. And it filled me with something that felt almost like pity. Almost. Julia shifted beside me, her posture straight and unflinching. "Under California law," she said in her crisp voice, "your marriage to Mrs. Holloway is legally binding. Any attempt to contract a new marriage without a dissolution is bigamy. That carries both civil and criminal penalties." Gasps. I turned slowly, letting my gaze travel over the rows of stunned faces. These were the same people who had nodded sympathetically when Walter told them I was unwell. The same people who had stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped seeing me as anything but a burden he'd been forced to discard. "Do you understand now?" I asked, my voice low. "I am not unstable. I am not confused. I am not gone." The silence that followed felt like the first true peace I'd had in years. No more pretending, no more wondering if maybe, somehow, he'd been right. I was standing in front of all of them with the truth in my hands, and I was done apologizing for it. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Chelsea let out a small, choked sob and sank down onto the front pew. I watched her shoulders shake, feeling an ache of sympathy I hadn't expected. She was collateral damage in his campaign to erase me. But she had made her own choices, too. I would not carry her guilt. Walter looked around as if searching for someone, anyone, who would come to his defense. No one moved. Not Janice, not his old business partner, not the friends he'd spent months whispering to about my supposed decline. The lies had rotted through everything, and now he was alone with them. I turned to the officiant. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. "I know this isn't what you expected." He shook his head, wide-eyed. I can't perform this ceremony." "No," I agreed quietly. "You can't." I looked back at Walter one last time. "You thought you could make me disappear," I said, "but you never understood me at all." And with that, I stepped aside so Julia could hand over the official papers. A cease and desist, a notice of intent to pursue civil charges, a request that he vacate the marital accounts immediately. All the things he thought I was too fragile to do. For a moment, it almost seemed as if he might say something, some final plea, some last defense. But he just stood there, pale and wordless. And I realized that, for all his cleverness, Walter had never prepared for the possibility that I might not be broken. He had no script for this, no lies left to cover it. The music had long since stopped. In the stillness, I felt something uncoil in my chest. It wasn't triumph exactly. It was relief, and the first hint of something like freedom. Julia touched my elbow gently. "Are you ready to leave?" she murmured. I looked around the church, at the flowers, the guests, the wreckage of his careful illusions, and then back at the man who had underestimated me for the last time. "Not quite," I said, because there was still one more truth to share, and I wanted everyone to hear it. It would have been easy to walk out then, to leave Walter standing in the wreckage he'd made, to let everyone piece together the rest of the story themselves. But I hadn't come here just to stop a wedding. I had come to reclaim the parts of my life he had stolen, the dignity he'd chipped away at with every whispered lie, every calculated omission, every pitying look he'd inspired in the people I'd once called friends. And so I turned back to face the congregation, steadying my breath. "I know this is uncomfortable," I began, my voice carrying through the hush. "I know some of you would rather pretend you didn't hear any of this, that you can go home and tell yourselves it's none of your business." A few people shifted in their seats. "But you all believed him," I continued, my hands tightening around the blue notebook. "You believed every word he told you about me, that I was unstable, that I couldn't be trusted to remember my own life, that I was fading." I felt my voice catch, but I forced myself to go on, and none of you thought to ask if it was true. For a moment, no one moved. Then Janice cleared her throat. "Marian," she said, sounding exasperated, "this isn't helping anyone." "It's helping me," I interrupted. I looked at her, really looked, and wondered how many times she'd sat in her kitchen, listening to Walter's stories, nodding along because it made her feel important to be included in the gossip. "You were the first one to call me unstable," I said softly. "Do you remember?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. "I do," I continued. "You called me at home, told me you were worried because Walter said I'd started forgetting things, that I needed help, that maybe it would be best if he took over our finances so I wouldn't embarrass myself." I let the words settle in the air, heavy and undeniable. "You never asked me if it was true," I said. Her cheeks went pink and she looked away. I didn't feel any satisfaction in it, just a quiet, bone-deep sadness, because it was easier for them all to believe I was losing my mind than to imagine that Walter was lying. I turned back to the rest of the guests. "I spent almost 40 years with this man," I said, my voice low but steady. "I loved him. I trusted him. And he used that trust to isolate me, to steal from me, to convince you all that I was too feeble to know what was happening." Chelsea let out a soft, choked sob. I met her gaze, feeling something almost like pity. "Chelsea," I said gently, "I'm sorry. I know you didn't ask for this." She shook her head, her mascara streaking down her cheeks. "He told me you were in a home," she whispered, "that you didn't know who he was anymore." A fresh wave of whispers rippled through the pews. I felt the room shift then, like a tide turning, as if finally they were starting to see it wasn't me who had been lost. Walter let out a harsh breath and tried to take a step toward me, but Julia moved to block him. "I think you should stay where you are," she said calmly. He glared at her, then at me. "This isn't necessary," he hissed. "You could have handled this privately." "Privately?" I repeated, feeling my lip curl. "Like all the little lies you whispered behind my back? Like the withdrawals? The stories about my so-called decline?" His mouth opened, but I didn't give him time to answer. "This was never going to be private," I said, "because you didn't just try to leave me. You tried to erase me." I turned, letting my gaze sweep over the faces watching me, some stunned, some embarrassed, some fascinated in the way people always are when they sense someone else's life unraveling in public. And I knew then that whatever they thought of me after today, I would no longer care. I had spent too many years worrying about what they whispered, too many nights wondering if they were right. That part of me was done. I took a slow breath and opened the blue notebook. "I want you all to hear exactly what he's been doing," I said. And then, voice clear and unwavering, I began to read. Dates, amounts, times he had called banks and pretended I was incompetent, records of the late-night calls he'd made to frighten me into silence, emails he'd sent to mutual friends, painting me as a confused old woman who'd misplaced reality itself. It took 15 minutes. 15 minutes to lay bare every calculated step he'd taken to cut me out of my own life. By the time I finished, Chelsea was shaking so hard her bouquet had fallen to the floor. Janice looked pale. Walter's face was blank, as if he'd finally realized there was no version of the story he could spin that would save him. When I closed the notebook, the hush in the church felt absolute, and in that silence, I felt something uncoil in my chest. Not victory, not triumph, just the quiet, exhausted relief of a truth finally spoken. I looked at Walter one last time. "I don't know when you stopped loving me," I said softly, "but I know exactly when I stopped loving you." He didn't ask when, but I told him anyway. "The day you decided my life was yours to rewrite." Julia touched my elbow. "Do you want to go?" she murmured. I nodded slowly, but as I turned toward the aisle, I paused and looked back at Chelsea. "Check the accounts," I told her, "and the documents. Don't take his word for anything." She met my gaze, her eyes wide and frightened, and then I walked away. I didn't look back again. I didn't need to. Some things, once broken, never deserve to be reclaimed. When I stepped out into the bright afternoon air, the world felt strangely unchanged. Birds still called from the trees that lined the church walkway. A breeze rustled the hem of my suit jacket. Cars glided past on the street beyond the low stone wall. If someone had driven by that moment, they never would have guessed that inside, a man's life had just shattered under the weight of his own lies. And a woman he'd once called unstable had stood tall enough to look him in the eye. Julia fell into step beside me, her face composed but solemn. "Are you all right?" she asked. I turned my face toward the sun, feeling the warmth settle on my skin. "I think so," I said honestly, because it wasn't relief exactly, not yet, more like the first deep breath after holding it for too long. The knowledge that whatever happened next, I would never again have to pretend I didn't know the truth. We reached her car, and I paused, my hand on the door handle. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for believing me." Julia looked at me with a softness I hadn't expected. "You did all of this yourself," she said. "I was just here to witness it." I almost smiled. Almost. When I got home, the house felt different. Not lighter, at least not yet, but no longer haunted by the same quiet dread that had followed me from room to room in those first months after he left. I set the manila folder on the kitchen table and poured myself a glass of water. My hands were still trembling a little, but they were steady enough to hold the glass, steady enough to turn the doorknob, steady enough to stand in front of everyone who doubted me and say, "This is what really happened." I sank into the armchair by the window and looked out over the yard. The grass had gone a little wild since Walter stopped coming around. I decided, as I watched a pair of sparrows flit around the old bird bath, that I would have someone come trim it. Or maybe I'd let it grow. After all, I was done keeping everything neat and acceptable just so people could pretend not to see what was really happening behind closed doors. The phone started ringing around dinner time. Janice called first. I didn't answer. Then it was my neighbor, Dolores' daughter, who had heard what happened from someone in the congregation. "She just wants to talk," she pleaded on the voicemail. "Everyone's so upset." I let it go to the machine. I owed them nothing. By nightfall, there were 8 messages blinking on the answering machine. I didn't press play. Not then. Instead, I took a shower and put on fresh pajamas. I made a cup of chamomile tea and carried it to the bedroom. And for the first time in months, I slept without dreaming of empty rooms and closed doors. In the morning, I listened to the messages. Janice's voice was tight with something halfway between anger and humiliation. "You had no right," she snapped. "No right to humiliate him in front of everyone. If you'd been reasonable." I pressed the delete button before she finished. The second message was quieter. Chelsea. "Marian?" she said, her voice raw and trembling. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Her breath caught. "I should have listened to you." I didn't delete hers. I didn't feel forgiveness, but I didn't feel bitterness either. Just the hollow recognition that she, too, had been lied to. The next message was from Walter. It was short. "You've ruined everything," he said, his voice hoarse. "I hope you're satisfied." And then the line went dead. I sat there a long moment, the receiver resting in my lap, and slowly I felt something like peace begin to bloom in my chest. Because he was wrong. I hadn't ruined anything. He had done that all by himself. Over the next week, the calls slowed. Neighbors stopped dropping by to check on me. Even the ones who still couldn't look me in the eye when they saw me at the post office. It was as if they decided it was easier to pretend they hadn't been complicit. That suited me fine. I had spent enough of my life worrying about whether other people approved of me. A few days later, Julia called to say Walter had formally received the notice of my intent to pursue civil damages for the funds he'd siphoned out of our accounts. "He'll probably try to negotiate," she said, "but you don't have to decide anything right away." I thought about that as I watered the plants in the kitchen windowsill, about whether I wanted to see him again, about whether there was anything left between us to salvage, even in the cold, transactional language of settlements and legal proceedings. And I knew, with the same clarity that had carried me down that aisle, that there wasn't. When I hung up, I felt a tiredness so deep it seemed to reach into my bones. But it wasn't despair. It was the tiredness that comes after surviving something you thought might kill you. I poured myself another glass of water and walked out onto the porch. The air smelled of lilacs and cut grass, and for the first time in a very long time, I realized I didn't feel like a ghost in my own life. I was still here, still standing. And no one would ever call me unstable again without knowing exactly how wrong they were. It's a strange thing, waking up in the quiet after the storm. For so long, I'd imagined that once the truth was out, once Walter was exposed, once the whispers finally stopped, I'd feel triumphant, victorious. But the truth is simpler than that. The truth is that freedom isn't a fanfare. It's a slow, quiet unfolding. It's the morning you open your eyes and realize you are no longer afraid of what people will say about you. The week after the wedding that wasn't, I kept to myself. I answered Julia's calls when she checked in about the legal filings. I returned Chelsea's tentative message, just once, to acknowledge that I'd heard her apology, and I ignored the rest. There was no point in rehashing the story with every neighbor, every relative who had swallowed Walter's version whole. Let them wonder. Let them piece together whatever narrative made them feel better about their own complicity. I had finally stopped caring. It was early June when the first official envelope arrived in my mailbox, A formal notice from Walter's attorney. An offer. A settlement proposal. I opened it at the kitchen table, the place where he had once left that coward's note telling me he couldn't do this anymore. I scanned the lines, the legal jargon swimming together until it was nothing but hollow words. It was more money than I'd expected, and less than I deserved. I folded the papers neatly, set them aside, and watched the light move across the countertop. In that moment, I realized that money was the last tether he had to me, that no matter what figure he offered, no check would ever be enough to pay for the years he had stolen, the friends he had turned against me, the way he had made me doubt my own mind. And I knew that whatever happened next, I wouldn't let the final chapter of our story be about his power over me. When Julia called later that day, I was ready. "He's proposing a lump sum," she began carefully. "It's not an admission of wrongdoing, but it's substantial." I thought about it, then shook my head, even though she couldn't see me. "Tell him I'll see him in court," I said. There was a long silence. "You're sure?" she asked gently. "Yes," I said. "I'm sure." Because some things are worth more than convenience. Some things are worth seeing through to the end. That evening, I sat in the living room with the blue notebook open on my lap. I read through every entry, every date, every time he'd tried to erase me, and I felt the last remnants of shame begin to lift. It wasn't me who had been unstable. It was him. Him and his desperation to pretend he could discard me like an old sweater he'd outgrown. But people aren't objects, and some of us refuse to disappear quietly. The trial date was set for August. I spent the summer preparing, meeting with Julia, reviewing statements, collecting witness lists. And in between, I started reclaiming the small corners of my life he'd made me feel unworthy of. I went back to the library to volunteer, ignoring the curious glances from the women who had once whispered behind my back. I bought a new dress, something bright and floral, and wore it to the farmer's market, where I walked past vendors who had gossiped about me all last year. I smiled at them anyway, because I had nothing to hide. By the time August arrived, I felt steadier than I had in years. And when the day of the hearing came, I walked into that courthouse with my shoulders square and my chin lifted. Walter was already seated at the long wooden table when I arrived. He looked smaller than I remembered, smaller without the protection of everyone's good opinion, smaller without the lies to prop him up. He didn't look at me when I sat down. He didn't look at me when the judge entered. It wasn't until Julia rose to begin her statement, outlining the years of financial manipulation, the fraud, the attempt to remarry while still legally bound to me, that he finally lifted his gaze. I met his eyes without flinching. Because whatever he had once meant to me, whatever power he had once held, it was gone now. I don't remember every word of that hearing, but I remember the moment the judge looked over the evidence Julia had laid out and turned to Walter. "You have committed a deliberate and sustained deception," she said, "not only against your wife, but against the state." Walter's shoulders sagged. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply felt free. When it was over, when the judgment was recorded and the damages awarded, Julia turned to me with a rare softness in her expression. "You did it," she said quietly. I nodded. "Yes," I murmured. "I did." I walked out of that courthouse into the late summer heat, the verdict papers tucked neatly into my bag, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt whole. Not victorious, though there was a satisfaction in having the truth recognized, but whole. I paused at the steps and looked up at the sky, the blue so bright it almost hurt my eyes. I thought about the woman I had been when Walter left me, the one who had doubted her worth, her memory, her sanity. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her this day was coming, that she would survive, that she would stand here, steady and unbowed, that she would reclaim her life. The breeze lifted the hair at my temples, and I felt it then, finally, fully, the quiet, defiant joy of a woman who had refused to disappear. It's funny how quickly the world moves on. By September, the courthouse drama had become yesterday's news. The neighbors stopped whispering, at least where I could hear. And Walter? He vanished from the town as thoroughly as he'd once tried to vanish me. I heard through Julia that he'd moved 2 counties over, that he was living in a small rented apartment while he figured out what to do next. I suppose part of me had wondered whether he'd try to call me again, to plead or to rage, to find some last shred of control over the story he could no longer contain. But he didn't. In the end, Walter was exactly who he'd always been. Someone who ran from consequences as soon as they arrived. A month after the hearing, I stood in the kitchen, the pale autumn light slanting across the floor. The house was so quiet, but it wasn't a hollow silence anymore. It was peaceful, clean. I sipped my coffee and let the calm sink in. For so long, I'd believed that if the truth ever came out, it would destroy me, too. That the humiliation and spectacle would prove he was right. That I was too fragile, too unstable, too diminished by age and disappointment to survive the fallout. But he was wrong. He'd always been wrong about me. It took time to learn how to live in my own skin again. Some days, I still woke up braced for the phone to ring at 2 a.m, for some new crisis or accusation to fall into my lap. But most mornings, I woke up to nothing more than the sound of birds in the yard. And I learned to be grateful for that simple, ordinary quiet. People began to reach out, tentatively at first. Old friends who had believed Walter's story called to apologize. A neighbor left flowers on my porch with a note that said simply, "I'm sorry we didn't ask your side. I didn't rush to answer them. I didn't slam the door in their faces either. I just let time do what it does. Soften the edges of old wounds without pretending they'd never existed." Chelsea called once more. I recognized her voice the moment she spoke. "Marian," she said, sounding older, sadder than I remembered. I've been seeing someone about everything. I needed you to know that." I closed my eyes, listening to her struggle for words. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for believing him, for not listening when you tried to warn me." There was a long pause. "You don't owe me anything," she finished. She was right. I didn't owe her forgiveness. But as I listened to the sincerity in her voice, I realized I didn't feel anger anymore. Just the tired understanding that we had both been used, and that we would both carry the scars in our own ways. "I hope you find peace," I said softly, before I hung up. It wasn't absolution, but it was the only kindness I had left to offer. I spent that autumn clearing out the last relics of our shared life. I boxed up photographs. Some I kept, some I threw away. I donated the suits he'd left behind, the monogrammed cufflinks he'd always been so proud of. I rearranged the living room furniture just to feel the space was finally mine. And on the last warm day of October, I took the blue notebook out to the back garden. I tore each page free, one by one. The receipts, the phone logs, the scribbled memories of a woman fighting to stay visible. I placed them in the old fire pit Walter used to complain about and struck a match. I watched the pages curl and blacken, the ash lifting into the air. And I felt nothing but release, because I didn't need the evidence anymore. I had carried the truth through the worst of it, and I had survived. No piece of paper could make me more real than that. By the time the sun slipped below the horizon, the last ember had faded. I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders and watched the darkness settle over the yard. For the first time in years, I felt like the world beyond the fence was waiting for me, not closing in around me. That night, as I turned off the lights and climbed into bed, I thought about all the ways I had been taught to shrink, to keep the peace, to be polite, to believe that a woman's worth faded as her hair silvered and her hands began to tremble. And I thought about how wrong that was, about how wrong it had always been. Because the truth is, it wasn't weakness that made me stay so long. It was hope. And hope, I learned, is its own kind of strength, even when it breaks your heart. I closed my eyes, listening to the quiet. I wasn't the woman he'd tried to leave behind. I wasn't a ghost. I wasn't unstable. I was still here, still standing. And finally, free.